Good morning, all. Isha.
Morning.
Gene, I want to thank you for that wonderful introduction and the recognition of to me, um, the real opportunity that's in front of us in these times. Um, uh, Building the table together is the only way that we're going to see a significant increase in a global commitment to sustainability. So I just wanted to thank you for that and all your work and everyone who um, is attending today, because I think these are the kind of discussions that we're supposed to be having in this time.
Yeah, and I also kind of want to echo what Deshaun said. I really appreciate everybody taking the time to. Is my audio okay, by the way? Okay. I really appreciate everybody taking the time to, listen to this conversation, and also I hope that there's some reflection for people to kind of go back and say, okay, what thought processes or assumptions or just ways of doing things have I been like falling into, and then trying to figure out, okay, how we move forward, how we make sustainability more equitable and a more inclusive space. All right, I seem to be having issues with my audio. Is this better?
Yep, a little bit. We'll work with it. And Isha, you just uh, speak as loud as you can, and I think that comes across really well.
Okay, cool.
All right.
All right.
Well, Gene, I know in talking about what the conversation would be today, I believe you wanted us to reflect on the past 4 months and not only with COVID-19, but also the racial reconciliation that is occurring and what it could mean for um, this movement and the opportunity that it presents. And I think maybe I'll start out and then Isha, please chime in. And in some ways, we are now kind of reflecting um, the opportunities that we can learn from this by having a multi-generational panel with me and Isha, because there's a lot to learn from the youth. So I think I would say a couple of kind of obvious things with COVID um, and the communities that are highly affected by COVID um, is an example of how we're kind of pulling back the curtain on um, challenges as it relates to the way our communities are situated, but in particular for people of color who are most affected by COVID. I think we've been given an opportunity to see what could be fixed, what needs to be fixed, and then what also can be then replicated when we talk about sustainability, right? And there has been a lot of comparisons to kind of the impacts of COVID-19 and communities of color and sustainability kind of all wrapped in. And we know it's somewhat of a reflection of our environment. And honestly, we could see that played out in climate change as well, because we are in some ways the most impacted um, and maybe the least heard. But now we have an opportunity that everyone can kind of see and feel that we are all connected together, and these problems that we share aren't just in one segment of society, but they are uh, across the board. Um, and so I think there's an opportunity for a discussion there. I think the same is true for some of the racial reconciliation that's occurring. Um, we all got an opportunity to maybe see what some segment of our population People of color, African Americans, and I'll just speak for myself. I'm African American. Um, the experience of interactions with law enforcement, but it's not just law enforcement. I think what we recognize is this is represented across all segments of society around dealing with racism that exists. But what we did is we saw, because we were at home, we couldn't deny what was in front of us. And so um, I think this is an opportunity, one, to come together, but to also highlight uh, and embrace the change that is coming. Um, and I think a lot of this is also represented by uh, the youth, who kind of have a different outlook. Um, so I don't want to dominate all this. I want to kind of create space for Isha, and we've been back and forth talking about some of the lessons that we're learning in this time. So, Isha, can you go ahead?
Yeah, so I think just coming from a youth perspective, so I'm 18, and I, obviously I think have a greater sense of urgency related to the climate crisis than most people here do, just because of my age. And so I think that, the 10 action steps that we've sort of outlined, I think they do a good job of kind of reflecting the values of my generation more, and also taking a step in the direction of racial equity and incorporating that into the sustainability space. But I still think that there is more that could be done. And so I think we'll get into this more during the panel. But I think from a youth perspective, there is a lot of really there are a lot of really interesting aspects to the document, especially because, as youth, our lifestyles are changing. So we rely a lot more on public transportation. We are less, about cars and houses. I know, college students that don't have their driver's license yet, which is a very different situation from a generation ago, where it seems like everybody has their driver's license at 16. So I think the kind of the rethinking our neighborhoods and strengthening our public transportation aspects of the planning is very good at reflecting that portion of the youth perspective. But I still do think that there's more room. And so I hope, after this conference and after this series of talks, that we don't just walk away hearing my voice, because I am kind of representing the youth here, but I also hope that we can walk away with the awareness that youth need to be included in these discussions afterwards. So as we're kind of, determining how we plan our cities, how we kind of move off fossil fuels, how we strengthen our communities, youth all need to be involved in those discussions. And so that's just something to keep in mind as well when we talk about these recommendations.
So I did want to reflect back to kind of the opening gene that you established, talking about how the table got set up. And I will kind of share an old adage that maybe people have heard before, but in my community it's used often, right? If you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. But we're actually beyond that now, right? We are building the table together. And I think if there's one thing when we talk about sustainability, we see different organizations embracing equity and inclusion. And I would say that's my generation, where all I wanted was an opportunity to get into the door and let me speak to my experience and my commitment to sustainability. But the reality is, there's been several, and I hate to admit it, there's been several generations after me. And they not only demand more, but I think what we've learned even from my generation is then there's diversity, but there's also diversity of thinking, right? And I think our movement becomes even more richer as we bring these voices along. And so I know that some organizations are talking about how could they be more equitable and more inclusion, but I think we're actually beyond that. We're actually in the space of how do we become an anti-racist movement embedded within sustainability. Again, if we truly believe that we're all connected, then that's what can be accomplished. And so let me just say, as we were kind of preparing, and even in the last meeting, there was some um, background noise, right? So if you hear Isha, she's got some beautiful birds as kind of the backdrop of our conversation. For me, I have kids in the backdrop of the conversation. That is our reality being virtual. Um, but I think there are many lessons that maybe we can get to talk about later. But I really wanted to kind of zoom into there's just this opportunity for us to be kind of an anti-racist society, because then that allows you to deal with things that are laid out very clearly in the top 10, right? We need to address housing in urban spaces. Um, there are other aspects of our society that we can address by being anti-racist. And so it goes beyond us being sensitive or being inclusionary. This is working to dismantle some of the systemic barriers that exist uh, that don't allow us all to thrive. Sorry about my voice. Isha, you mind jumping in? I should grab some water.
It's still morning, so um, yeah, I think I definitely agree with what you said, and I think right now we have kind of a unique opportunity because we are kind of not necessarily at a standstill, but we are being forced to do things differently. And I think in some ways we have kind of slowed down and we have more opportunity because, everything's a little bit up in the air. So we have more opportunity to start changing our approaches to our work and our organizations and just our life in general. And I think, if we can all take that time to reflect and consider how we can actually be anti-racist. I know, Deshaun, you mentioned when we were talking a few days ago, you mentioned that like rewiring yourself is important, right? And I think that we all need to do that. And I think right now, many of us are probably feeling a little bit of guilt because obviously racial inequality and oppression has been part of our society for so long. And I feel like right now it's kind of a turning point where a lot of people are realizing, hey, I haven't done anything about this before. And I think it's one thing to feel guilty, but it's another thing to kind of channel that energy into more productive activity. So after this conversation, I encourage everybody to think about how your hiring practices, and I think just having more, just even educating yourself, I think is really important, and getting access to articles and perspectives of African American intellectuals is really important. And I think it's something that we all have to look really critically at ourselves. I think like in our organization, in Earth Strategy, recently we actually did a really critical review and we found that, one of our programs kind of rested on a premise of not like white saviorism because our leadership is mainly people of color, but it was a little bit problematic. And so right now we're kind of trying to figure out how to shift our values, shift our goals, and shift our tone to reflect a more equal perspective. So I think that's something that we all need to take from this conversation and to go home and think about.
Yeah, rewiring is, I think, a good way uh, to think about the changes that we're experiencing together. And I think also giving places for people to land. So, for example, what I have gotten into over the past few years, and this, this author would probably be familiar to some of you, is Brene Brown. A lot of her work around belonging and value. Um, Again, I think COVID is driving us in that direction. And so, as far as the works or the rewiring, those were some of the examples I would give. And then also, I don't know if we've all heard about this professor at Princeton, Angela Duckworth, where she talks about kind of the top 10 things that successful people do to get through high stress situations. And what Angela Duckworth talked about was that if we can think about, maybe our situation is bad, especially with COVID, and let's say you're having challenges in your business or life, or even around these works related to sustainability. If you don't think about them from the perspective of this is impacting me and impacting me only, but to think about it from perspective that we're all in a community that are all being impacted. And so you acknowledge that we're all kind of together, and that's one way that you can persevere and overcome challenges, is acknowledging you're not in them together. And again, that is the lesson of these last 4 months, is there's a message to African Americans and people of color, that, and indigenous folks, that their challenges are our challenges, and we're in this together. Well, what I'd like to do is actually go back to the top 10, because I think this could be there's a portion of this that is a real fruitful conversation, and it is rethinking our neighborhoods. Isha, and if you remember, we talked about it. I could talk about it as a social justice advocate and an environmentalist, saying in order to protect the urban growth boundary and conservation areas, is that we need to make the urban areas work. And I've done a lot of work involved in that. And so, for example, before COVID, I worked on the Equity Open Space Initiative, which really looked at how we can preserve green spaces in urban areas. And in this time of COVID, that might be the only place that we go. And so maintaining a level of quality of life, I think it's to think outside of the box around these issues. And knowing that in the urban spaces, we still need to have spaces where conservation occurs. And so that's one thing. And I would say what I'm seeing under COVID is our parks in Tukwila are highly utilized, and see whole families that maybe at first weren't there. And so we have an appreciation for maybe some of the things we took for granted. But rethinking our neighborhoods has been a very tough issue for jurisdictions. And so as an elected leader, it's been difficult to make sure that we provide options for other housing and transit-oriented development. But all those challenges have been worth the risk, because it's a commitment to protect the environment and to insulate us in some ways from the impacts of climate change. But that's totally from those two perspectives. Isha, I know you have an interesting perspective, which you, kind of discussed previously, but I think it would be so beneficial. And even, well, I shouldn't say even, it's beneficial to me to hear your perspective as someone who's younger than me. What I should be thinking about or considering that maybe I would have never considered under the guise of rethinking our neighborhoods.
Yeah, I thank you for bringing that up and for kind of redirecting the conversation. I think, like I said earlier, I think strengthening it and also including more options for housing. So, um, multifamily homes and more sustainable options is really important. And I also think, so I know one of the things mentioned in the top 10 is increasing walkability of our cities. That's also a big one. And I think because fewer and fewer millennials and young people are about owning cars, that would greatly benefit the region. And also, I don't think this is on the top 10, but I would like to see just more infrastructure or kind of redesigning for not only pedestrians but also bikers, because I feel like a big reason that we don't go out and bike places is just because of safety risks. And I hear that from a lot of people. They're like, I really wish I could bike and enjoy the scenery, but it's just not feasible with these roads because there's just too much danger. Um, so I think constructing a better system for our bikers and making that uh, a more common activity could be good. And I think one of the things mentioned in the top 10 was kind of creating like a hierarchy of different transportation modes. And I think that's not really doable unless we're making sure that all those transportation modes are safe and accessible for people as well. So that's one thing to keep in mind is if we're going to encourage different modes of transportation, we also need to build the infrastructure for that.
Right, right, and maybe I'll lean in a little bit here. I just remember growing up, born in '72, and then the '70s and the '80s, and I think the '90s. It was still that your goal was to be at a position where you can buy a house, and then you have your nice single family home, and that's a success. But I've lived long enough to see that there are other options, and there are other options that people choose. And so I'd love to kind of hear from your perspective, Isha, kind of your view of kind of what maybe um, your perspective of what your dream would be, or that and I know it's hard, so forgive me for asking for you to represent your whole generation, because I know that there's diversification, and it's not a monolith, but I think people could benefit from hearing your perspective on um, kind of the kind of spaces that you want to live in. And I think you've already said livable, walkable neighborhood, um, more bike lanes, a real um, balance of transportation modes. But what are some other considerations that you think you're making as kind of um, someone who's at that age where you're thinking about these kind of things?
Yeah, so I know affordability is a really big issue because I think, and I don't know if I'm being a broad brush, I appreciate that you're considering the diversity of the generation and acknowledging that. I think, but as in general, I think we like urban spaces, we like big cities, maybe more than previous generations, just because I feel like we like to be more connected to people. We like to have people more, immediately close to us. This is kind of in the age of social media, so we're always connecting socially. We just really like proximity, and so I think my generation, we kind of gravitate more towards urban areas, but at the same time, we really want nature. And both of those things are very difficult or not difficult, like absolutely difficult, but they are definitely less affordable than other options. And especially in the United States, like living in, an area like Seattle where you have access to the waterfront, but then you're also in a very urban area, all of that is very expensive. And so I think finding a way to make housing more affordable and making access to nature more affordable, because right now we put such a price on water and on access to water. And I'm not sure that that should be the case because, you know, it's kind of commodifying nature in a sense. But um, but yeah, I think we really need to think about how we're making housing more affordable. And
Yeah. So it looks like we're kind of coming close to, wow, that was really fast, close for our conversation. And maybe I'll start uh, with this and then really kind of let you close us out. Um, One thing that one of my peers and people that I respect said that in COVID, um, uh, there was a social experiment um, around transportation, and that because of COVID, we were forced to either stay home um, and traffic improved. And that became a choice that we made together. And so when you think about COVID and the racial reconciliation, we know what's possible. And again, that social experiment of not being on the roads and reducing congestion and all that, it became a thing that is real. Um, you know, the commute to work, we never thought any of this were possible, but it is a change of behavior and we have that opportunity. So when we think about our resilience, and maybe Isha, you can close around resilience and our ability to think outside the box. What would be your message, not only on the top 10 and in this discussion, um, but how can we make sure to continue to think outside the box so that we are more resilient as a society?
so you mentioned a really good point, which is that we had a choice. We had a choice to stay home, and even if it was, you know, bound by some constraints, I think we still. What matters is that we willfully figured out how to change our lifestyle on a really big scale. And so I think here everybody today watching kind of has a choice, which is to either, you know, continue with the previous lifestyle we had when COVID evolved. We go back to work, you know, we go back to not thinking as much about the intersection of sustainability and also maybe the inequalities that this whole crisis has raised to people's attention. Or we can kind of think forward and we can, you know, get on a different path and think more critically about, okay, here we have this chance to change our practices and, you know, make sure that our society is not this disparately impacted by such a crisis, especially the oncoming climate crisis. We're going to see the same things like you mentioned, Deshaun. So you can choose to think anti-racist, to think in a more progressive way about sustainability, and to really just think outside the box.
I'm on mute, but I think we are at the end of our time.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Isha. Thank you very much, Deshaun. Deshaun, you had so much to say. My really fundamental takeaways from you are that this is a time when we can make great change. But in terms of making that great change, we almost have to rewire ourselves. So change our behavior, and then we'll be able to make other great change.